He walked into the room. Nobody noticed anything unusual. He smiled, made a joke, joined the conversation, and for a few minutes, everything seemed normal. Then someone asked him a question he didn't understand. He laughed, looked around, and quietly copied the answer from someone else. Nobody said anything, but inside, something changed, because he knew he hadn't understood it, and he hated that feeling. So he did what many people do when they feel intellectually exposed. He pretended. He changed the subject, made another joke, acted confident, maybe even became slightly arrogant. And if someone challenged him, he became defensive. From the outside, it looked like confidence, but underneath it was something much more complicated. Insecurity, fear, and the terrifying possibility that other people might discover what he already suspected about himself. Now, before we go any further, there's something important to understand. Having a lower IQ score does not automatically mean someone is unintelligent in every area of life. Intelligence is complicated. People can differ in memory, reasoning, creativity, practical judgment, emotional awareness, social intelligence, and experience. And an IQ test measures only certain cognitive abilities under specific conditions. So this isn't about labeling men as stupid. It's about understanding a fascinating psychological question. What can happen inside a man's mind when he repeatedly struggles with tasks that seem easy for other people? Because the answer isn't simply, he doesn't understand. Sometimes the deeper story is, he knows that he doesn't understand. And that changes everything. Think about school. A boy raises his hand. The teacher asks a question. He knows everyone else seems to understand. He doesn't. Someone laughs when he gives the wrong answer. Maybe it happens once, then again, then again. Eventually, he learns something more powerful than the lesson itself. He learns that being wrong is embarrassing. And that lesson can follow him into adulthood. Years later, the same man is sitting in a workplace meeting. Someone explains a complicated idea. He doesn't understand it. But instead of saying, "Could you explain that another way?" he nods. Yeah, exactly. He has no idea what exactly means, but he's learned that admitting confusion can feel more dangerous than remaining confused. And this is where the psychology becomes fascinating. Because sometimes what looks like arrogance is actually self-protection. What looks like laziness may be avoidance. What looks like stubbornness may be fear of being exposed, and what looks like confidence may sometimes be compensation. But here's what almost nobody realizes. When people repeatedly experience difficulty in an area, they don't always respond by becoming more humble. Sometimes they construct an identity around not needing to know. I don't care about that stuff. Those people just think they're better than everyone. School doesn't mean anything. I already know enough. And suddenly, ignorance becomes part of the personality, not because the person consciously chose ignorance, but because protecting the ego became more important than learning. That's where everything changes. Imagine a man who struggles to understand complicated financial concepts. Someone tries to explain investing to him. He becomes frustrated. Instead of asking questions, he says, "It's all a scam anyway." Maybe it isn't, but now he doesn't have to admit he doesn't understand it. That's psychologically convenient. And humans are remarkably good at creating explanations that protect our self-image. Daniel Kahneman's work on cognitive biases helps illuminate part of this process. Our minds don't simply process information objectively. We use shortcuts. We protect existing beliefs. We look for information that confirms what we already think. And when being wrong threatens our identity, the emotional reaction can become stronger than the intellectual one. That's why a simple disagreement can suddenly become an argument. You aren't discussing an idea anymore. You're defending yourself. And for some men, that defense becomes especially important because masculinity itself can create pressure. Men are often taught, directly or indirectly, that they should be competent. They should know what they're doing. They should solve problems. They should provide answers. They should be decisive. So imagine constantly feeling like you don't measure up to that image. What happens? Some men become quiet. Others become aggressive. Some withdraw completely. And some become extremely confident in areas where they feel safe. This is where the psychological concept of overconfidence becomes interesting. There is a well-known phenomenon in psychology involving people who have limited knowledge in an area, sometimes overestimating their competence. But there's an important detail people often miss. It doesn't mean that everyone with lower cognitive ability walks around believing they're a genius. Reality is much more complicated. Confidence and competence don't always move together. Someone can be highly skilled and insecure. Someone can be inexperienced and extremely confident. And someone can be intelligent while still making terrible decisions. That's why IQ alone cannot explain a man's personality. But cognitive difficulty can interact with personality, environment, education, and emotional development in powerful ways. Now consider relationships. A woman says something complicated. Maybe she's trying to explain how she feels. I don't feel emotionally connected lately. A man who struggles to process abstract emotional language might hear something completely different. You don't love me. So he reacts defensively. What do you mean? I'm here, aren't I? She tries again. You're physically here, but I don't feel understood. Now he's frustrated because he's looking for a concrete problem to solve. What's wrong? What do you want me to fix? And she isn't asking for a repair. She's asking for emotional understanding. This is where cognitive ability and emotional intelligence can become confused. A man can struggle with abstract reasoning while being deeply caring. Another man can be intellectually gifted while being emotionally immature. These are different dimensions. But when someone has difficulty understanding another person's perspective, relationships can become exhausting. Not necessarily because he doesn't care, sometimes because he genuinely doesn't see what the other person sees. And that distinction matters, because if you assume every misunderstanding is intentional, you'll interpret the person as cruel. If you assume every misunderstanding is harmless, you'll excuse behavior that hurts people. The truth is somewhere in between. Understanding why someone behaves a certain way doesn't mean you have to tolerate everything they do. Now something unexpected happens. The internet enters the picture. A man who feels intellectually insecure doesn't have to sit alone with that insecurity anymore. He can find a community, a video, a comment section, a creator who tells him exactly what he wants to hear. You don't need to learn. You're smarter than the experts. Everyone else is lying. You don't need evidence. And suddenly, his uncertainty disappears. Not because he learned something, because someone gave him certainty. This is one reason modern algorithms can be psychologically powerful. They don't simply show people information. They can repeatedly show people versions of the world that feel emotionally comfortable. A man who already feels misunderstood may discover content telling him that everyone else is the problem. A man who feels unsuccessful may find someone promising instant wealth. A man who feels rejected may discover content explaining why women, society, employers, or friends are supposedly conspiring against him. The message is comforting because it removes responsibility, and responsibility can be painful. But here's the danger. If someone never develops the ability to question information, they're easier to manipulate. That's true regardless of IQ. They can be manipulated by politicians, influencers, scammers, advertising, extremist communities, relationship gurus, financial schemes, even ordinary friends. Because critical thinking isn't simply about knowing facts, it's about being willing to say, maybe I'm wrong. And that sentence requires something deeper than intelligence. It requires humility. Think about that. A person doesn't need to be brilliant to improve their life, but they do need to remain teachable. That's one of the most important psychological differences between someone who struggles cognitively and someone who becomes trapped by those struggles. The first person says, I don't understand this yet. The second says, I don't understand this, therefore it must be nonsense. Those two sentences create completely different futures. Now let's bring this back to relationships. Imagine a man who doesn't understand why his partner is upset. He could ask, help me understand. Or he could decide, she is being dramatic. One response opens a door, the other closes it. And this is where emotional maturity becomes more important than intelligence. You don't have to understand everything immediately. You need to be willing to learn. You don't have to have the perfect answer. You need to be willing to listen. You don't have to win every disagreement. Sometimes you need to discover that you were wrong. That's strength. But for someone whose identity depends heavily on appearing competent, admitting I don't know can feel like losing status. And that brings us to something much bigger than IQ. Here's what makes this bigger than just intelligence. Human beings are constantly comparing themselves to one another. Who earns more? Who speaks better? Who looks better? Who has more followers? Who has the better career? Who gets more attention? Who seems more intelligent? Social media has turned comparison into a full-time activity. A man can spend 30 seconds scrolling Instagram and see another man with a successful business. Then TikTok shows him someone younger making millions. Then another video shows a man giving relationship advice, and suddenly he feels behind. That feeling can become shame. Shame can become anger. Anger can become defensiveness, and defensiveness can become identity. This is why intelligence should never be reduced to a ranking. Because a person's life is influenced by opportunity, education, poverty, or privilege, environment, trauma, health, social support, discipline, and thousands of other factors. A test score doesn't tell you someone's entire story. And perhaps the most dangerous mistake is assuming that intelligence determines human worth. It doesn't. A person with a low IQ can be kind, loyal, creative, hardworking, emotionally perceptive, excellent with people, skilled with their hands, a wonderful parent, a devoted partner, and a person with a high IQ can still be dishonest, selfish, emotionally immature, or destructive. So what should we actually look for? Not whether someone can solve the hardest puzzle. Look at how they respond when they don't know. That's the real psychological test. When you explain something, do they listen? When they make a mistake, do they learn? When someone disagrees, do they become curious or hostile? When life becomes complicated, do they ask for help? When they're embarrassed, do they attack the person who embarrassed them? Or can they laugh and say, "I didn't know that"? That sentence may reveal more about a person's emotional development than any intelligence score. Because intelligence without humility can become arrogance, and limited intelligence with humility can still produce wisdom. Think about the older man who never had a formal education but knows exactly when to listen. He doesn't pretend to understand everything. He asks questions. He watches. He learns from experience. He knows what he doesn't know. Now compare him with someone who has impressive qualifications but cannot admit a mistake. Who is wiser? That's not a simple question, and that's exactly the point. Human beings are multidimensional. Now imagine the man from the beginning again, standing in that room. Someone asks him a question. He doesn't know the answer. This time, he doesn't laugh. He doesn't pretend. He simply says, "I don't know." And someone explains it. He listens. Maybe he asks another question. Maybe he gets it wrong again. But something has changed. He's no longer protecting an image. He's learning. And slowly, the fear begins to disappear. Because the most damaging thing isn't having difficulty understanding. It's becoming afraid of being seen learning. That fear can keep a person trapped for decades. So here's the bigger picture. The psychology of men with lower measured IQ isn't a story about stupidity. It's a story about how cognitive differences interact with identity, confidence, education, masculinity, relationships, and social pressure. Some men respond to difficulty with humility. Some respond with avoidance. Some become defensive. Some become dependent on people who make them feel competent. And some build a completely different kind of strength. They accept their limitations without allowing those limitations to become their identity. They learn slowly. They ask questions. They surround themselves with people who challenge them without humiliating them. They stop pretending, and they discover something incredibly freeing. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just have to be willing to learn from the room. That's the part people forget. Your intelligence may influence what comes easily to you, but your attitude toward learning influences what happens next. So if you've ever felt slower than everyone else, if you've ever been embarrassed because you didn't understand something, if you've ever pretended to know something because you were afraid of looking stupid, remember this: not knowing is not the failure. Refusing to learn because you're afraid of being wrong is where the real trap begins. And perhaps the most intelligent thing a person can ever say isn't, "I know." It's, "I don't know yet." Because those two final words leave the door open. And sometimes, an open door is all the mind needs to change. If this helped you understand human behavior a little better, subscribe and join us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And until next time, keep learning what really drives human connection.